Hello, this is Terrence McNally. The UN's latest report paints a frightening picture of the time we've wasted and the urgency with which we must act now to avert the worst of climate change. And the Daily News tells us that the unvaccinated are welcome hosts for the deadly evolution of COVID-19, though they may not believe in either. Journalist and author CHRIS Mooney has been tracking the costs of science denial for years. Here's our 2011 conversation about his articles, The Reality Gap, and the science of why we don't believe science. Hello, I'm Terry McNally, and welcome to Freeforum. I've said before on this show that I believe for a system to thrive and evolve, intelligence should offer guidance and direction. Now, with unprecedented technological power, humanity now more than ever needs human-driven, intelligent design, if you will. Some of our gravest challenges, climate change, the energy crisis, national economic competitiveness, and some of our gravest threats, global pandemics, nuclear proliferation, have fundamentally scientific roots. Yet America has trouble with science. For every 5 hours of cable news, less than a minute is devoted to science. A minute out of 5 hours. 46% of Americans reject evolution and think the Earth is less than 10,000 years old. The number of newspapers with weekly science sections has shrunk by 2/3 over the past few decades. The public is polarized over climate change, an issue where political party affiliation determines one's view of reality. And they're in retreat from childhood vaccinations. Only 18% of Americans have ever even met a scientist, and more than half can't name a living scientist role model. On Freeforum, we explore the lives, the work, the ideas of individuals that I suspect have pieces of the puzzle of a world that just might work. We look at new, innovative, and provocative approaches to business, environment, health, science, politics, and media, all based on the fact that I believe we can do better, and I want to find out how. Today's guest, CHRIS Mooney, is a senior correspondent for the American Prospect magazine. He's the author of The Republican War on Science, Storm World, Hurricanes, Politics, and the Battle of Global Warming, and Unscientific America, How Scientific Illiteracy Threatens Our Future, which he co-authored with Cheryl Kirschenbaum, with whom he also writes the Intersection blog at discover.com. You can find that intersection there. And in 2005, I think I ought to mention this, CHRIS was named one of Wired Magazine's 10 Sexiest Geeks. What made me call CHRIS today is a couple of recent magazine articles that he's done. One just came out in Mother Jones not long ago, titled Rapture Ready, The Science of Self-Delusion, and the other in the American Prospect called The Reality Gap. And what CHRIS has done that caught my eye was, he's been, obviously, you heard the names of the books, he's been writing about this and looking at this stuff for a while. But what he's done in the first of these articles, the Rapture Ready one, is looked at the science of why is this happening, and the science of why people don't believe science. And in the second one, the Reality Gap, sort of looking how it's actually, sadly, and maybe not unexpectedly, seems to have political lines drawn, that those of one party are more or less likely to believe science and to give credence to science and all of that sort of stuff. So we're going to look at that for the next hour here with CHRIS Mooney. CHRIS, welcome again to Pacifica Radio and Freeforum.
It's great to be with you again.
Okay, and as I know I asked you the last time I interviewed you, but I think it's an interesting note. I like people to get a feel for the people and not just the ideas we talk about. You didn't set out to be a scientist, and you didn't set out, I don't even think, to be a science writer, yet clearly your career now is, as your blog says, at the intersection of sort of science, politics, culture, all of that. How did that happen?
It's a great question. I now see it through a different lens because of some of the things that I say in that second article you mentioned about how science and liberalism kind of go together psychologically. But in any case, I had a very influential person in my family, my grandfather, Gerald Cole, a biologist, freshwater biologist. They call him limnologist, but he was certainly very big on evolution. And it rubbed off on me, all of his defenses of Darwin and these charming rants when we were growing up. I really kind of took in that whole worldview. And so that was always with me. I wanted to be a writer. I didn't know what kind. So suffice it to say that when I finally got my chance to write at the American Prospect magazine, I then gravitated towards scientific topics once I had some freedom.
Okay, and then and as I can imagine, as a young writer, you write one or two things that get a lot of notice, leads to a book. The book, The Republican War on Science, was a bestseller, and now suddenly this is where you are. Do you ever get let me just say, I know Roger Ebert, right? Everyone knows him as I think the number one film critic in the country. And he's done an amazing job, actually, of making himself an online presence as well. But he writes op-eds for the Chicago Sun-Times as well that have nothing to do with film. Do you ever write or have the urge to write about other subjects?
Sure, it happens, but less and less because I've got my hands full, and I think that there's still so much more that I can do. I'm really trained as a political writer, so I can do that, but I find that my skills are best used at this intersection because I know how to cover science and I know how to write about politics, and you don't really find those things going together very often because to know how to write about science, you need a little bit of training. I mean, it's not actually a formal training necessarily, but you need to actually figure out how it's done a bit, or else you'll mischaracterize things.
Right. And I mean, I was impressed, actually, at the number of footnotes in the Mother Jones article. I mean, it looks like, footnote-wise, you're competing with academics.
Right. Well, in some ways, that article is an uncommon one in the sense that it's like a big literature review, hopefully well written, but it gives you this big overview of all the research that too few people know about how biased reasoning works and how it creates the situation in which we'd have people, completely disagreeing about what science says and completely polarized about it. This whole field of motivated reasoning, which is what the article's about, I sort of popularized it. And in the process of doing that, I definitely was able to put a lot of links to all the published literature. I mean, there's a vast amount of peer-reviewed research that is either directly on this or closely related to it.
Right. So what's interesting is at the same time as you're writing about people's tendency to reject expertise, that article certainly shows, plenty of expertise. Let me talk just a little bit about what you wrote about in the earlier books. I'm going to read a quote from Unscientific America, and then I'd like you to talk about it a little bit. A 2008 analysis by the Project for Excellence in Journalism found that if you sit down to watch, as I said in the intro, 5 hours of cable news, you'll probably see 1 minute's worth of coverage devoted to science and technology, compared with 10 minutes of celebrity and entertainment, 12 minutes of accidents and disasters, and 26 minutes or more of crime. From 1989 to 2005, the number of newspapers featuring weekly science sections shrunk by two-thirds. Washington Post killed its science page. CNN laid off its entire science, technology, and environment unit. At a moment, as I said in the intro again, when science really is of critical importance, why is this happening in America?
Unfortunately, this is driven by economics, not the centrality of science to policy or decision-making or our lives. It's a weird contradiction. Basically, what's happening in the media is the implosion of the old business model, especially for newspapers because of the growth of the Internet. So they're not flush with cash in the same way they can't subsidize parts of the paper that don't make the same amount of income as the really popular parts. So, these specialist kinds of coverage get cut. And that's what we've seen happen. And then science migrates to the web. And there you have a different set of issues. There's certainly tons of it on the web. Whether anybody finds it's another question. But this is solely about media economics.
Okay. And what about our education system? Is that delivering as much science education as it used to, or my suspicion, based on the fact that so many schools are paying so much attention to reading and math scores on tests, is that teaching to those tests may have driven science, if not out of the classroom, into a just smaller coverage?
Oh, yeah, there's huge problems with science education in the U.S. We have some spectacular schools for the really advantaged. But for the most part, it's not nearly what it ought to be. And that's one of the reasons. I mean, another reason is just that science education is under attack across the country. If it involves evolution or now increasingly climate change, you have teachers not teaching it, and you have parents rising up against them when they do teach it. So it's also way politicized.
Right. I'm Terry McNally. I'm speaking with CHRIS Mooney, senior correspondent for the American Prospect magazine, author of The Republican War on Science and Unscientific America, How Scientific Illiteracy Threatens Our Future, co-authored with Cheryl Kirschenbaum. And Cheryl and Chris also write the Intersection blog at discovermagazine.com. You mentioned the internet, which is where science has gravitated. The problem there is not lack of information, but a couple of other things, isn't it?
Sure, too much information, nobody ever finding it, and people self-selecting them into little groups where everybody agrees with them, and, and becoming more and more sure of themselves. It's a different thing. It's not. It has its benefits and its costs, but it doesn't restore what you had before, which was more shared information about science.
Right. Now, I noticed neither of these articles quite go into that thing about the people talking more and more to people of their own mind, of their own culture, and so on. Whether it's social media, whether it's the internet, whether it's something else that's going on. What's your, what is the scientific take or the educated take on what that's doing?
Oh, it's just working together with other things to make us very, very polarized and take away the sense that we have a shared view of facts or reality. I mean, in Mother Jones, I wrote about the psychology of why people can't accept inconvenient information. In the American Prospect, I wrote about, one necessary consequence of that we see around us all the time, which is that Democrats and Republicans don't agree about the facts at all. Even though the facts are discernible and you can figure out who's right, they still just don't agree about them. But, if you take the psychology of why we deny information that contradicts our deeply seated worldviews, and you combine that with a media that makes it very easy to wall yourself off and allows you to sort of seize on the information that you like and never have to encounter or just ignore the information you don't like, then I think you're just worsening some basic human tendencies.
Right. We're going to go into the science. I want one more question, though, about the journalism piece, which is one of my pet peeves, and I know you've written about it, is this sense that proper journalism includes objectivity, and then this interpretation that objectivity means I present two sides to every issue. And I probably, it seems to me in so many cases I come across, do not stick my neck out enough to say the difference between the two sides, perhaps in how they're accepted or what their credibility is or what their, all of that. And so you get a preponderance of science is one thing, a few people say another, and they're presented as equal.
Yeah, I mean, this is terrible journalism, and especially once you start to think about how this plays itself out psychologically across the populace, you realize what kind of cost this has for our ability to discern what the facts are. But basically, if there are facts, then you don't equivocate about what they are as a journalist, and you don't give two sides about what's true. Unfortunately, this laziness is everywhere. And, even among the places that are good and don't perpetrate that kind of bad journalism, nevertheless, there's so many different kinds of journalistic venues now that you can find many where that will happen.
Right. Okay, so I'm talking with CHRIS Mooney, and we're going to talk now about a couple of his recent magazine articles. The first one, you open your recent Mother Jones article. It's titled Rapture Ready, The Science of Self-Delusion, with a quote from psychologist Leon Festinger, and I'm going to read the quote. "A man with a conviction is a hard man to change. Tell him you disagree, and he turns away. Show him facts or figures, and he questions your sources. Appeal to logic, and he fails to see your point." I think that really sets it up great. And then you tell the story of Festinger's infiltration of a cult called the Seekers, who believed there would be a cataclysm, an earth-shattering cataclysm, on December 21st, 1954. Not a bit unlike the recent prediction of the rapture for May 21st of this year. Tell us what happened when they infiltrated that group. I found that a very fascinating story.
Well, they became members, and they wrote a book about it. And, of course, what happened, what always happens with these end-of-the-world predictions is that they're wrong. But that's less interesting than what happens psychologically in the minds of the people who make the predictions. And that is that they then rationalize. They come up with some reason why their belief system wasn't wild and crazy, but in fact, it's just that they missed some little detail, but it turns out that, it was part of God's plan anyway, or it was part of the aliens' plan anyway. And so in the case of the Seekers, their rationalization was that, By believing what we were supposed to believe because the aliens told us to believe it, we saved the world.
I love that one. Yeah. In other words,
Yeah.
we believed it so hard that they spared us. And
Right.
they spared everyone else in as well.
Right, which is very flattering to the ego. And then with Harold Camping and his, woeful prediction, the rationalization was different, but we could predict based upon this psychological research that there would be a rationalization. And his was that there was a rapture, but it was an invisible spiritual rapture.
Oh, I didn't even hear that. I thought he just changed the date again. No, he really said there wasn't.
Well, he always meant the world to not end. He just meant the rapture to happen, and then the world was going to end later. So he sticks to the prediction of the world ending, I believe, October 21, something like that.
Yeah.
So he'll be wrong again.
Right.
But and he'll rationalize again, and we know this because this is how the human mind works.
Okay, now let's go into how the human mind works. And I'm going to quote you again. An array of new discoveries in psychology and neuroscience has demonstrated how pre-existing beliefs, far more than any new facts, can skew our thoughts and color what we consider our most dispassionate and logical conclusions. What's going on there?
Well, Festinger called it cognitive dissonance, but we actually, now I think a more updated term, not that that's wrong, is motivated reasoning. And basically what it means is that you have a strong commitment to a worldview, political view, an emotional commitment, a relationship, what have you. If your emotional connection is strong enough, then challenges, you'll be defensive towards challenges, and you will basically rationalize why you're going to stick with your pre-existing commitments. And what's so scary about motivated reasoning is that it says that this is happening basically subconsciously and automatically. In other words, you get a threatening stimulus. You don't even know you've gotten it because your mind, most of what your mind's doing, you're not conscious of. But you've already been threatened, and you've already had an emotional defensive reaction, and then your mind proceeds to retrieve the memories and thoughts and associations that you've always retrieved before that bolster the worldview and that, basically are the fabric of the worldview. And so then by the time you're thinking in the context of all of these things that are your identity. And so then you come up with something to say, something to argue, what have you, that's basically not changing your view, but rather reinforcing your view.
Now, what's interesting is in the way I was listening as you laid that out, and it took, a minute or so to sort of describe this sequential nature of this, that the way I get it is that the emotion happens first, the reasoning happens second, and that first and second sounds like some separation. It's split seconds, isn't it?
Oh, yeah. Well, no, it's milliseconds. I
mean, of course.
Yeah, but the point is that the emotion biases the reasoning.
Exactly.
So that's what you need to know. And it's happening automatically.
And it's happening instantaneously.
Pretty much.
So because I'm sure someone goes, and then, as you were saying, and then you reach for these memories and thoughts, and you think this, and no, it's happening instantaneously. That, and you pointed out, threat. It also happens to something we're interested in. In other words, basically, if I understand it right, we emotionally tag everything, every perception that we get. Good for me, matters to me, doesn't matter to me, don't need to pay attention to it, threatening to me. And this kind of tagging is what happens instantaneously, and only then do we begin to think at all. Right.
What neuroscience is showing, and I'm not a neuroscientist, I'm reporting on it,
right.
Is showing that, emotion and reasoning are not separate. And again, I'm not speaking as a neuroscientist, I'm giving my science journalist understanding of how this works.
Mm-hmm.
When you engage in this process of memory retrieval after you've had your, initial stimulus, then, the things that you retrieve are emotionally tagged also.
Yeah. And so as you said, a piece of information seems threatening, you immediately tag it, and then proceed it again instantaneously to begin to think that you're thinking without that emotional tag. That's the trick, right? Is that most of us think that we're actually reasoning and being rational when in fact there's no such thing as total rationality.
Well,
and what you said are that they're almost one.
Mm-hmm. We don't know this is happening. Neuroscientists know this is happening because they can measure it, and they're elucidating how the process. But you yourself don't perceive this happening.
Right. I'm Terrence McNally, and the voice you hear is Chris Mooney, senior correspondent of the American Prospect, author of The Republican War on Science and Unscientific America. He's also a co-author with Cheryl Kirschenbaum of the blog The Intersection at discovermagazine.com. And we're talking about recent Mother Jones article, Rapture Ready, The Science of Self-Delusion. And if a person, what happens, let's say, and I want you just to lay it out a little more so we're really like seeing it as an example. You mentioned this, a person hears about a scientific discovery that challenges her belief in divine creation, that they found a new hominid that seems to buttress evolution and so on. What happens next?
Well, so you're a creationist, and it's in the news. You could perceive some science news, and there's some new fossil finding. And, of course, it's interpreted in light of evolution. Well, you're firing negatively. And you have heard from, I don't know, your pastor, it depends on how engaged you are, how much you've read creationist literature or something like that. But you have all these associations, and very negative with evolution. But you also have all these reasons that you don't believe evolution. So you quickly are able to retrieve those, and then you're gonna think and maybe argue some of the things that to you refute the new information.
Okay. And what is confirmation bias?
Well, confirmation bias is closely related to this, and that is that, if you have to go on a search for information to defend your worldview, then confirmation bias means you're going to find the stuff that supports what you think, and you're not going to pay attention to the stuff that doesn't.
Mm-hmm. And it even, there have been experiments that even your predisposition influences what you think is a credible source or a credible expert.
So you can do confirmation bias with experts, right? You can say, I need an expert to support my creationist view. Well, look, here's this PhD who's a conservative Christian, and they've got some of those,
Yeah, exactly.
So that's who you find, and you will ignore, I don't even know how many, but it's thousands and thousands of scientists, who are. In fact, there's over 1,000 scientists named Steve who support evolution. So.
That's right. Yeah, you put that up. That's what?
Yeah.
That's. Is there a website called?
Yeah, it's called Project Steve. Google it. It's a joke about this.
Right.
But they found 1,000 Steves, or some large number of Steves.
Right. What motivates us to not seek the truth? What is the evolutionary explanation? In other words, you think, as I sort of said at the top of the thing, that you'd want intelligence to drive a society, you'd want intelligence to drive a system, you want intelligence to drive your organism. And yet, something in evolution leads us down this path. What is it?
Well, to be fair, sometimes you can have accuracy motivation. It's just that oftentimes you don't. Oftentimes your motivation is more self-affirmation and to protect yourself from threats. There's a lot of reasons, and I think it even makes sense in light of evolution to defend what you feel you've learned over your life, because that it's served you well, in a lot of ways. You're a functional human being. The belief system is the result of a lot of experience and a lot of knowledge, so it makes sense that you don't discard it easily.
And is there another thing that's going on there nowadays that we perceive, and again, remember what we said about perceiving, it's this emotional, rational kind of dance going on, but we perceive symbolic threats and respond to them the same way that we millennia ago responded to actual threats?
Sure. The reason we have this ability to rapidly respond in a way that we're not even conscious of is that evolution creates that. Okay, if there's a danger, you want a machine, an organism, that's going to be able to react to it hyper fast. So that's why we have this whole system, and it's the same system that animals have. We have a much more different capacity too. Which is the reasoning capacity, but we have the older quick-fire emotional response in defense system.
But as I was saying, it's that somehow I would imagine for most animals and for early humans, the threat and the treat were, animal, dangerous weather, clap of thunder meant lightning. That might be a problem, or the smell of food was a good thing. And yet now it's someone's idea that has taken. I mean, what do scientists say about that linkage? What is? You get where I'm going with that.
Right, and so I guess I'm going to speculate here. I mean, it's the fact that it excites the emotional system in this way that really matters, and so ideas can do that. It's a kind of self-preservation. It's preservation of the identity. It's not preservation of yourself from being eaten. But I think as long as the emotional power is strong enough, then.
And I guess what I'm also imagining, and I think it's what you're saying also, is
but
that
I'm actually speculating here. I mean, I'm not fully satisfied that I understand the complete link between the evolutionary science here myself and the motivated reasoning. And I think that, I actually I've been planning to do more calling and interviewing. I've heard Michael Shermer.
He's got the new book. What's it called? The
Believing Brain, and he's got an explanation for part of this where he talks about, you can make two types of errors, and let me see if I can get this right. I mean, either the thing that you see rustling in the bush is going to kill you, or it's not. It's just wind, right? Either it's a tiger or it's wind. And evolution is going to select for you to basically be defensive no matter what, because if it's a tiger, you're more likely to be safe, and if it's not, and you run, well, you haven't been hurt very badly.
Right. No,
so,
I get that. It's the relative value of the interpretation to some extent, right? You don't go wrong.
So it's okay to make the error. It's okay to make the error to preserve yourself.
Yeah.
That's kind of the logic.
Right. Interesting thing you say, Chris Mooney, is that I'm going to quote you again. Head-on attempts to persuade can sometimes trigger a backfire effect where people not only fail to change their minds when confronted with the facts, they hold their wrong views more tenaciously than ever. This one, is a bit confounding. Talk about that.
If you've got someone who has a strong view and it's very important to their identity and they're closed-minded, I mean, they fixated on this view. If you try to refute it, then we have experimental evidence that that actually the belief can be strengthened. So what it suggests is that persuasion is not what liberal, rational, Enlightenment-inspired scientists seem to think it is, which is you give the information and then everyone goes, aha, that's what it was. It's often going to be very, very different than that.
You're saying that what would persuade is going to be very, very different, or you're saying that the response to persuasion is going to be very, very different?
Both.
You're right.
And sometimes persuasion is just not going to happen. I mean, if you've got someone who's seized on something, and psychologists call it high on need for closure, and they've got closure, they're not open. So it's not clear exactly what you do. But if you trigger the defensive reaction, then you're going down the worst path.
And they will actually hold to their wrong belief even stronger. You talk about the Northwestern study, where even Bush's own words contradicting the idea that Saddam Hussein and al-Qaeda were aligned doesn't persuade a Bush supporter from dropping that belief.
Right. And if you show them that Iraq didn't have weapons of mass destruction, a lot of them will hold the belief stronger in another related study. So these are some examples of political falsehoods that have been incredibly influential, and the psychology research shows that a motivated reasoning process along with a belief perseverance or, psychological defense process is operating.
Right. No, I remember that actually the idea that that Saddam had weapons of mass destruction actually increased. The percentage of people who believe that increased over at least some period of time long after it had been discounted.
Well, in the study that I'm talking about, among conservatives, when they refuted that view by making them read an article that stated it and then stated it was wrong, it increased the belief.
Amazing. And what I was saying, I remember in polls, they found.
Oh, maybe so.
Yeah. Oh, yeah. In polls, I think it was July after. I mean, it was months after that actually the numbers were higher than when the story was originally out of alignment between Saddam and Al Qaeda and weapons of mass destruction, that it went up. Let me say we're at the halfway point here. I'm Terrence McNally. I'm speaking with Chris Mooney, senior correspondent for the American Prospect, author of The Republican War on Science and Unscientific America, co-authored with Cheryl Kirschenbaum. And Cheryl and Chris also write The Intersection, a blog at discovermagazine.com. Hello, this is Terrence McNally. You're listening to my 2011 conversation with Chris Mooney, who's been tracking the costs of science denial for years. We talk about his articles, The Reality Gap, and the science of why we don't believe science. Let's look at how some factors play. Does education make a difference?
Education's good for a lot of things, but what I argue, and not so much in this piece, but giving talks after it, I think, is that if you have a very strong belief that's emotional, then what the research shows is that you will commit various kinds of logical fallacies and bad reasoning to defend it. And this is the mechanism for why that happens, because you'll just try to find an argument, any argument. So if you teach people, logic and reasoning and so forth, it's certainly a good thing, but the emotions can be powerful enough that it can skew that process. So there's studies that show that people commit more logical fallacies defending, their own belief, but then they can see the logical fallacies in somebody else. Or hypocrisy. There's one of these motivated reasoning studies that's really interesting. Drew Weston, I believe he's at Emory, and he did this in an fMRI machine, so he saw the brain's emotional circuits firing, but he set up partisans in the 2004 election, Democrats and Republicans, and he showed them statements from Bush and Kerry followed by, contradictory information that made it look like they'd done something hypocritical or contradictory. And what happened in each case, right, was that the Democrats saw hypocrisy in Bush but not Kerry as much, and the Republicans saw hypocrisy in Kerry but not Bush as much.
Right,
so,
and what you're saying is that the experimental situation he'd set up, they were both equally hypocritical.
Sure.
Yeah.
I mean, I think actually the statements were, I don't remember exactly. I'm not even sure the statements were true. They were just set up to be contradictory.
That's right. It was just given this information, what do you think?
Yeah.
But I think the other thing that I remember reading was that people who are more educated can be just as guilty, and in some sense even more so. That's one thing I found interesting. Talk about that.
Sure, because you have more confidence in your views and your ability to find out what's true, and you have more capacity to reason and to find new supporting information. So you're empowered. I mean, motivated reasoning is partly, based upon, how much energy you have, how many resources you have to apply to this task. And so if you have a lot of education combined with a strong bias, then you're going to be incredibly hard to change.
Yeah, no,
and you're going to be very eloquent and,
Yeah, that you now have a different set of tools than the less educated person, but you don't necessarily use them to arrive at accuracy. Once that motivated reasoning sets in, you use them the same way the other person does, but you have more tools.
Right.
Yeah, wild stuff. Talk about a couple of specifics. We've mentioned some of the beliefs about some of the political beliefs, but in the scientific realm, what's the current status right now of a climate change debate? And talk a little bit about ClimateGate, that the hacking and the discovery of emails of climate scientists and so on. What happened there, and what's the outcome?
Well, so the science is overwhelmingly clear that humans are causing global warming. It's happening now. We don't know exactly how bad it's going to be. There are a lot of reasons to think it could be very, very bad indeed. The public is not following the science. The public is divided, and it's divided largely along partisan lines. If you didn't want to accept the science, then ClimateGate, which was this pseudo-scandal in late 2009 with emails released somehow from climate researchers in England, was a godsend to you, because you could use confirmation bias and et cetera to seize upon this and take it as evidence, which people like Rush Limbaugh do. Take it as evidence that refutes pretty much every bit of science that's ever been done.
Right, right.
But there's a scandal, and these scientists, they've said some things in emails that were a little unfriendly, and that is used to discount the whole body of research. I mean, now, is that reasonable? No, but does it make sense in terms of how we think about the brain processing information? Yes. If you have a really strong need to attack climate science and you have a strong need not to believe it, then something like ClimateGate will be really, really appealing to you.
And it seems also we run into that thing. I remember when we look at crime, was there access? Could it have happened, and was there motivation? And the right-wing talk show folks and so on will say that the motivation of why would scientists contradict science, and they say it's because it builds up, if you can build up climate science, you're going to get more grants and make more money and more prestige.
If you were going to refute climate science, you're also going to get that.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. What about, because here's one that I know you were looking for. Is it just falling on the right? And you in the second article, which we're going to talk about more in a moment, the reality gap, you actually look at that whole question of right, left, or Democrat, Republican, or progressive, conservative, and so on. But what about the suspicion of vaccines? What is the scientific consensus? Who are the deniers, and what is it they say? And how has that one played out? Because that one is an interesting case.
Sure. Well, so there was a scare in the late 90s about vaccines causing autism. And there were claims made, and they were widely publicized. And some of them were based on a scientific study that since then in The Lancet has been dismantled, and The Lancet retracted the paper and all the rest. But it got so much attention. A lot of people heard about it, and a whole kind of activist community rose up around this idea that vaccines were poisoning kids, causing them autism. It took a long time for scientists to respond in terms of doing the science to determine whether that was true, but eventually, a lot of studies were done, large epidemiological population studies where they use the most powerful statistical techniques they have to determine if there's a correlation between vaccination and autism, right? And they ruled it out. Been ruled out repeatedly, and because of the scare, the alleged offending agent in the vaccines was taken out, so it's not in there anymore.
That was thimerosal, the mercury.
Right.
Yeah.
So that was what the scare was about. Two things, but that was one of the main parts of it. We see autism rates continue to rise,
even though the component that was being blamed has been removed. So
scientifically, this doesn't have anything at all to stand on anymore. Do you see the belief go away? No, right? Because that's not the way the mind works. You were asking then a bit about the politics of it. I think what's interesting of it is that it's not right-wing. I've been challenged on this. I said it was left-wing, and I think many parts of it are. Because it has this left-wing narrative to it. It's about, big corporations poisoned our kids. And so that has that appeal. But actually, in polling data, which is not good on this, you don't actually find that much of a political difference.
I see. In other words, there are people that this one doesn't go left-right, that there are just people who have a theory that science has contradicted, and they hold to that theory.
Actually, I'd put it a little different. I suspect this one is more on the left, but the polls don't support it.
Oh, okay.
But the polls aren't very good. So that's kind of where I am on it.
Okay.
Yeah.
And it's funny because someone listening could say, wait a minute, Mooney's doing the same thing he just said. People do. The polling contradicts his theory, and now the polls aren't that good.
No. So I was challenged on this, and by the reasons I said I thought it was more on the left, I think are good. But I was challenged on this, and I was asked to present polls to support it. And so I went to find the polls. And the polls made me basically step down a bit from my view. So I think I've done what I'm supposed to do.
Okay.
But the polls are not sort of directly on point in a lot of cases.
got it.
It's like, did you hear what Jenny McCarthy said on this date?
Uh-huh.
So I don't think you caught me on this one.
No, I didn't. But I certainly, for a listener, I couldn't let that one go by.
Yeah.
Okay. Now, Let me ask you about this because I deal a lot some in the radio, but some outside of the radio. I work with nonprofits and foundations on communications. And one of the lines that I often say, I quote Annette Simmons, who wrote in The Story Factor, facts don't have the power to change someone's story. Your goal is to introduce a new story that will let your facts in. Is story or narrative a way to deal with this? In other words, we talked before about facts, persuasion, expertise, and so on. Doesn't seem to make any difference. Is there anything to? I don't know. I don't know whether there's been any science done as to whether story or narrative has power that facts and expertise do not.
Yeah, well, I think the answer to that's obvious, and George Lakoff has done science on it,
Oh,
and
good.
others probably have too. But I mean, stories organize information and they tie it to emotion, basically. So they can be way more powerful because you understand, what context the information fits into. And so persuasion is maybe, if you wanted to get someone to accept some information, you find the story in which it fits that will appeal to them emotionally. So I think that this is very, very important.
Okay, in other words, the story allows you to embed your information in a Trojan horse, if you will, in something
Trojan horse. Yeah.
something that they will allow in.
Possibly, yeah. I mean, another way of referring to this is framing.
Mm-hmm.
Finding the script, the narrative script that appeals to the worldview. Yeah, and there's even evidence of this working. So.
Okay, yeah, that's right. I know that Weston and Lakoff have written some of this. Let's shift now to the second article. I was talking about the reality gap, which was in the American Prospect. And again, let me tell people, I'm Terrence McNally. I'm speaking with Chris Mooney. He's a senior correspondent in American Prospect, also writes for other publications, including Mother Jones, best-selling author of The Republican War on Science, co-author of How Scientific Illiteracy Threatens Unscientific America. And he blogs in a blog called The Intersection at discovermagazine.com. Oh, before I jump to this article, how would you characterize The Intersection?
The Intersection is my blog at Discover, and it's been around for almost 10 years now. It was originally called The Intersection because it was a place where science and politics meet. Now it's more the intersection of science, culture, society, but it's basically a blog where I consider scientific controversies and scientific topics as they rise and as they, prompt resistance and controversy. So it's a science politics blog.
Okay, very good. So what is your main point in the reality gap?
I like to think of that article as an attempt to sort of rewrite my book, The Republican War on Science, with some psychological insight. The Republican War on Science was written in this very rational mode where I'm like, here's the science, here's what they say, they're clearly wrong, they're attacking science, which is true, but it didn't really get at the motivations and the process. And so I still think, and it also made another, not error, but it didn't understand fully that basically it's not just science where that happens, it's anything that people care about.
Mm-hmm.
Science is not unique. It's unique to those of us who think in this academic way, it's science and there's social science and there's humanities. And how dare you undermine science because it's so strong. But no, anything that ticks people off will be undermined. And so I treat science issues the same as I treat political misinformation, like claiming that the health care reform bill created death panels.
Right. And in the reality gap, you deal with all of those sorts of things.
Right.
Yeah.
I think they're all going to be the same as soon as they're politicized. And so what I'm trying to say is, we all have biases, and yet clearly something's going on where if you look at the contested political factual issues that we disagree about, the facts seem to support the Democrats. And not always, but most of the time. And at the same time, if you look at academia and you look at science, those are overwhelmingly Democratic, and they're becoming more so right now. How do you explain this? And that's what I attempt to do.
Right. And let me just say that what we know is statistically, let me read something from your article. In one of the most comprehensive surveys of American professors, sociologist Neil Gross, University of British Columbia, Solon Simmons of George Mason, found 51%, this is American professors, 51% described themselves as Democrats, 35% described themselves as independents, and just 13.7% were Republicans. Now, the right points to this same information, and their interpretation is it's because universities are centers of indoctrination, and that what I find interesting is that it seems, although affirmative action has been opposed by certain right folks when it might apply to race or gender or immigrants or anything, it almost sounds like they're calling for affirmative action when it comes to colleges, faculties, professors, etc.
And I kind of am of the view that it won't work, and because what I come up with in terms of explaining all this is I go again to the psychology literature, and I talk about the differences, and there's a lot of published research on this, between the liberal and the conservative personality. And basically their personality traits, they're widely accepted scales for measuring them, and liberals rate higher on one key personality trait that is very relevant to us here, and it's called openness to experience, which includes, abstract ideas, it includes traveling, it includes, and openness to experience is the kind of trait of personality that is likely to make you an academic. It also means tolerance of uncertainty, ambiguity. This is what you need to be a scientist.
Now, let me put these two articles together, and it seems that what we've said is that that it is human nature, if you will, to deal in motivated reasoning, right?
Yes.
However, what you're saying is that on that continuum of human behavior and human personality, it seems, what I was listening to, openness to new experience, openness to new ideas, those flexibility and so on, it sounds like that we're saying there is a continuum, and that although it's not entirely one side or the other, that someone of a certain more open personality might be less susceptible to motivated reasoning. They would also be more likely to be progressive.
Right, and I want to characterize that last bit as a hypothesis, in that there's no study of liberals and conservatives to see who does more motivated reasoning. And I definitely think that liberals do it. I think I've done it. I think that you can also find cases, and I found them in the article, where you can show that liberals are more likely to be wrong about something. So, it's not like one or the other.
Right.
But the psychology research that I'm mentioning does at least suggest something. I mean, it suggests that liberals are more inclined towards academia and science. It suggests that conservatives...
I see. Let me just say what you're saying there. Is there more drawn to that? So it is. That's why you said you don't think that even affirmative action would work. It's just that a certain kind of mind, a certain kind of worldview, a certain kind of perspective and personality is more drawn to that kind of work.
Right, and these are just tendencies in large populations, right? I mean, every individual is unique. It's important to say that. And openness to experience is just one part of your personality. So it's not like this predicts everybody. But it's a tendency that's real and statistically real in large populations. So, and the conservatives, just by the same token, are more drawn to certainty. And also need for closure, it's called. This suggests that they're going to have a different relationship. At the same time, we know that they have different moral systems. And so that suggests that when they do, challenge information, they're going to challenge it for different reasons. And it doesn't also, all of this, by the way, does not look good for liberals, I want to emphasize, because they have this Enlightenment worldview about using science to make the world better, which is very naive in many ways, in the sense that they think that giving people good information is going to persuade them to do the right thing and the best thing. And the brain doesn't work that way. And also, in terms of openness versus closure and so forth, what that means for liberals, and this could be pejorative, is it makes them indecisive.
Uh-huh.
It makes them spineless, if you want to be really negative about it. And that's more likely to be the case, whereas, conservatives are more able to be decisive, and you often need to be. So this is not like, liberals are great or anything like that.
No, right. It's a package of tendencies and a package of likely responses and behaviors that, depending on the situation, depending on the job, depending on the moment, can go one way or the other. I'm Terrence McNally. That's the voice of Chris Mooney, and we're talking about a couple of his recent articles Rapture Ready and Mother Jones, and the reality gap in the American prospect. Um, when it sounds, this thing that you just pointed out about how the downside of the openness and the flexibility can be spinelessness. One thing that one of my analyses of the current political view out there, the political arena, is that both sides derive significant, if not primary, funding from the same sources. That is, the very wealthy and the corporations. And what we have then is Republicans who happen, it seems to me, to have their principles, their platform, in sync with their funders. So when they say we're going to shut down the government, or we're going to, let's not say that one, but we're against health care, we're for this, we're not for that, they have a clear goal line and they are going for a touchdown. Democrats have or progressives at least, have a tendency, a set of principles that sort of says, no, we believe in a social contract, we want to we have concern for everyone in society. But because that is not necessarily their funders' view, they say, we're going for the 20-yard line. And they end up negotiating with themselves. We've seen it with Obama on health care, on cap and trade, on Wall Street reform, and so on. Now, that's my analysis of what goes on. My analysis of what that means is, one, no one is actually going full out for the really progressive principles, or very few. And two, the bystander, the political person watching this, notes what you were saying and says, these people have the strength of their convictions, these people don't. Your thoughts about that whole analysis?
I think what we've just said about personality explains a lot of that, doesn't it?
Yeah.
The analysis is true. It's complicated and probably worsened by the fact that basically the country moved right. So the Democrats are sort of centrists, and centrists are also, very on the one hand, on the other hand.
Right.
So you could imagine if the country was shifted way left, you might have more dogmatic strength of their conviction on the left. It's debated whether rigidity and decisiveness on the left ever match what's on the right. That's a big debate in the psychology literature. But we don't have that anyway. So.
Right. No, it's interesting. I wonder if in the 60s, when the predominant culture was a 50s culture and the left culture was, stop the war, stop the military-industrial complex, it's okay to be gay, it's okay to have premarital sex, whether you get what I'm saying. It seemed to me in that time the left seemed to have more conviction than has happened since the shift to the right. Culture.
More conviction, and the politics was further left.
Yeah.
So the two go together, and it's not quite clear what the relationship is between the underlying psychology and how that interacts with the politics, because it's always a combination of culture and nature, so to speak.
Right. Tell us just a little bit about, you say the psychological literature clearly shows there are these different personality types. Lakoff has his strict parent, nurturing parent model, and there are others. Can you just kind of tell people a little bit about, what actually is the psychological analysis of these things? What are some of the models that are out there?
You see, there's a lot of models, and I think they all have more in common than divergences. So you have this personality stuff where liberals have got the openness to experience and conservatives prefer order, you've got Lakoff, where the conservatives have got the strict father-family model, and liberals have got the nurturant parent. That's related. You've got this other model that divides it up into four groups, and it's really interesting because it's also related, where the conservatives have got individualistic values and hierarchical values. And hierarchy is, order, and individualism is government, leave me alone. It's a harsh world out there, and we need to be able to compete and thrive without sort of a wild, wild west kind of thing. And then the Democrats, liberals are egalitarian, so we need to preserve equality, and communitarian, we need to take care of everyone in society, and that's the nurturant parent. All these things are being shown to be accurate in studies.
That's what I was going to ask. In other words,
Yeah.
what we're saying here is not that Lakoff has a theory, or that psychologists have a theory. They've tested these things, and that's what I want to get for listeners to know, is that this is not just theory. They've tested it, and although they're always having to, when you do these sorts of tests, you're setting up a situation you think shows something, and then you analyze the data and so on. But basically, in what I would call sort of simulations of real life, these theories hold up.
Well, yeah, they've been tested in different ways.
For instance, can you give
with
someone a sense?
the personality, openness to experience, I mean, that's a very simple test. You administer, in the most simple iteration, you administer to someone a political questionnaire, where you administer to a large sample a political questionnaire, and then you administer a personality test. And then you just correlate the variables, right? And the responses. And that's where you find liberals higher on the openness thing, conservatives higher on the conscientious thing, which is like having an orderly space and then routines and things like that. Okay, so that's easy. And that's been done over and over and over again. What Lakoff's doing is building on his expertise in cognitive linguistics and talking about the metaphors that underlie our politics. He has a lot of expertise. He's not, I think, testing it in quite the same way. With the individualist, hierarchy, egalitarian, communitarian, et cetera, basically what you can definitely show is that you survey people, again, to determine their views, and you can put them into these categories, and then they have different views of reality based on what category they're in. Yep.
Thank you so much, because as I say, these are things that, in both the cases what we've been talking about, it's things that people kind of have a gist about, but I really like the fact that you've put the science behind how we think about science or how we think about each other. Chris Mooney's books are The Republican War on Science, Unscientific America. The two articles we've been talking about are Rapture Ready at Mother Jones and The Reality Gap at The American Prospect. You can also find his intersection blog at discovermagazine.com. You can listen to this week's conversation and many others anytime during the week by listening to our podcast. You can sign up to have it delivered to you weekly, and you can do both of those things at either my website, terencemcnally.net, which is also a worldthatjustmightwork.com, whichever is easier for you to remember, or iTunes. At the website, you can also find podcasts, articles, transcripts, and so on. And you can sign up there to get my weekly announcement, an email announcement telling you who's going to be on and what we're going to talk about and some background on the issues. You can also do that by emailing me at temcnally, temcnally, @mac.com. Thanks to Devin Jordan, my engineer, Stan Mizrahi, and Mark Maxwell in production, Matt Perez in traffic, and to you, my listeners. I look forward to being with you again next week. And finally, thank you, Chris Mooney, and keep up your good work.
Thanks for having me.